Tomorrow is Martin Luther King Jr. Day. If you haven't seen the new film Selma about the voting rights marches, I encourage you to, and this is the most appropriate weekend. Who has already seen it? Anyone out there? Okay, so a few of you. Good. Among the many reasons to see this powerful film is that it includes two Unitarian Universalists who were martyred in Selma. The Reverend James Reed, you can recognize him by his iconic bow tie. He was a minister affiliated with All Souls Unitarian here in D.C. President Johnson invoked Reed's murder in calling for the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Dr. King preached his eulogy in Brown Chapel in Selma, Alabama, in March of 1965. Viola Liuzza, a UU laywoman, was also killed by members of the Ku Klux Klan in Selma. Both are depicted in the new film. I'll be saying more about Selma in a sermon on March 8th on the actual 50th anniversary of the marches. In the meantime, if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend as well the excellent book by my colleague, the Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed, called The Selma Awakening: How the Civil Rights Movement Tested and Changed Unitarian Universalism. And one of the many reasons why the film Selma is so riveting is that it focuses much more on the background dynamics behind those Selma marches than those very public events that we're more accustomed to seeing. And the often hidden background is what I would like to focus on this morning. Among the many important and significant figures that made Dr. King's leadership possible, I'd like to share with you some about Rosa Parks, the rest of the story. Some historians have argued that without Rosa Parks, we would never know the name Dr. Martin Luther King. I'll be drawing some from an important new biography published in 2013 by Beacon Press from political science professor Jean Theoharis, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. Parks mostly is remembered, and we heard some this morning, for that one isolated act in her life, an important act, a vital act of civil disobedience, being arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man. For her courageous act of conscience that helped catalyze the Montgomery bus boycotts, she has been called the mother of the civil rights movement. Upon her death in 2005, she was the first woman and the second African American to have her body lie in state in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. To quote some representative commentaries at that time of her death in 2005, then Senator Barack Obama described Rosa Parks as a small, quiet woman whose name will be remembered. Senator Hillary Clinton similarly recalled quiet Rosa Parks moments. The New York Times called her the accidental matriarch of the civil rights movement. Almost universally, she was remembered as quiet, humble, soft-spoken, dignified, not angry, and never raised her voice. She was remembered almost exclusively for that one moment in time when she refused to stand up and give up her seat. This romanticized view of Rosa Parks masks the fullness of her life, which includes nearly 7 decades of activism. Her refusal on December 1st, 1955, so that's 50 years ago this past December, to not give up her seat was deeply shaped by more than a decade of previous activism that led up to that point. And she continued to work for social justice for nearly 4 more decades. And although she recognized the strategic value of nonviolence, far from being meek and mild, Rosa Parks said publicly her hero was Malcolm X. She certainly loved and admired Dr. King greatly, but Malcolm's boldness and clarity, his affirmation of what needed to be done for black people, made him her champion. Indeed, Parks' family, like many black Southerners, had long kept a gun in their homes, even as they publicly participated in nonviolent activism. Remembering the fullness of Parks' life can remind us of the importance of committing long-term, over many decades, to a cause and to advance a cause of social justice. And as important as individual acts of conscience are, they often and usually emerge out of and are most effective when connected to a larger ongoing community and movement. Along these lines, Theoharis, Parks' biographer, notes that whereas many closer looks at public figures to demythologize them. Usually what that ends up is exposing their all too human flaws. But she writes, it's a rare gift to deconstruct the popular narrative, to demythologize a historical figure, and in the process discover a more impressive and substantial person underneath. And that is the case with the rebellious life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. Rosa Louise Parks was born in 1913. Her grandparents had been enslaved. Parks grew up amidst the terror of the Jim Crow era. It was World War II, though, that really catalyzed her move toward activism, as she watched black soldiers like her brother go overseas, serve honorably in the U.S. Armed Forces to defend freedom and equality in the world, only to return home and be treated with unfreedom and inequality. Seeking to make a difference in December 1943, so that's more than a decade before that moment, on December 1st, 1955, she attended her first meeting of the Montgomery branch of the NAACP. Coincidentally, it was election day. She was the only woman present and was elected to be secretary. If you see the film Selma, one of the many wrenching scenes involves a woman played by Oprah Winfrey struggling to register to vote in the face of a corrupt registrar's intimidation tactics. And from 1943 to 1955, again a decade before the events in that film, Rosa Parks was one of those women. She finally prevailed through extreme perseverance and clever strategy, and she was able to vote in 1945, a decade before that bust. She voted for governor in 1945. And throughout the late 1940s, Parks traveled throughout Alabama through her role as an officer in the NAACP, documenting suspicious deaths, attacks on black women by white men, instances of voter intimidation, and other incidents of racial injustice. If someone was a victim of racial injustice, it was widely known in that decade before that one night in 1955 that Rosa will talk with you, as part of gathering evidence for a federal anti-lynching bill and related legislation. All of that groundwork, starting in 1943, is part of what culminated in her decision, December 1st, 1955, to not give up her seat. But it's also important to note that after more than a decade of painstaking, dangerous, often demoralizing work of organizing in the 1940s and 50s, recording all those incidents of terror in the Jim Crow South, major systemic changes began to happen in the lead up to that moment of December 1st, 1955. A year and a half earlier, on May 1954, is when the Supreme Court issued the ruling, Brown versus the Board of Education, declaring segregated schools to be unconstitutional, overturning the racist precedent that Parks had lived with her whole life in 1896 of Plessy versus Ferguson, that had said separate but equal is okay. A year later, on May 31st, 1955, only 6 months at that point before that day on the bus, the Supreme Court issued the follow-up ruling of Brown 2 that integration must happen with all deliberate speed. Significantly, 2 months after that Brown 2 decision, from July 24th through August 6, 1955, Parks attended a 2-week workshop at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee entitled Racial Desegregation, Implementing the Supreme Court Decision. Beyond the important content of that training, Parks was deeply impressed by the simple practice of whites and blacks eating together and sleeping together in the same dormitory, sharing the same space. She wrote that the naturalness of the Highlanders' integration, evident but not belabored, was key, and it deeply impressed her. Showed her what was possible, as she had seen with her brother's experience in the Army. Also, only weeks after Parks completed that Highlander training, 14-year-old Emmett Till's horrific murder in Mississippi captured the attention of the media and the world, and especially this country. Parks wept when she saw the image of Till's body in Jet magazine. Furthermore, 4 days before she would make her historic bus stand, she attended a packed mass meeting at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church about the series of recent lynchings in Mississippi. So she was reminded freshly, just 4 days before, of the horror that had recently been happening in the state of Mississippi, next door to Alabama. As Theo Harris writes, the popular view of Parks as either an accidental or angelic heroine misses the years of gathering courage, fortitude, and community, which then enabled her to refuse to give up her seat. Now, there's a lot more to be said here, especially about the history of bus resistance that precedes Park and Montgomery leading up to December 1st, 1955. But for this morning, I will skip ahead to that fateful evening. I didn't know previously that Parks, and Laura said a little bit about this earlier, had a humiliating confrontation with that same bus driver. That had actually happened in 1943, that same year that she joined the NAACP. And she had intentionally avoided that bus driver for 12 years. But that evening, she was tired, she was distracted, she was looking forward to a short 15-minute bus ride home. Her husband was doing what he should be doing, cooking her dinner. And she was enjoying the Christmas decorations out the bus window. Also related to the unplanned timing of her act of civil disobedience, she had never before that evening in her entire life directly been asked to give up her seat by a white person. That evening, because the white section was full, when a white man boarded the bus driver called for the first row of the middle section to be cleared, which would mean 4 African Americans, including Park, all giving up their seats so that one white man would not have to sit beside them. In Parks's words, people always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired. But that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or I was no more tired physically than I was at the end of every working day. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in. It's important to note as well that the city code gave, and I find this really odd, but it gave the power of police officers to every bus driver. Every bus driver was white and considered a police officer, and all bus drivers carried guns. Theo Harris records that the bus was crowded and the tension heightened as the driver walked back to her after she didn't answer his call to stand up. Refusing to assume a deferential position, Parks looked him straight in the eye. The driver asked, "Are you going to stand up?" And she replied, "No, because I got on first and I paid the same fare, and I didn't think it was right for me to have to stand so that someone else who got on later could sit down." "Well, then I'm going to have you arrested." "You may do that," Parks replied. Given her NAACP organizing experience, she was exceedingly cognizant. She had spent the past decade recording horrific things that had happened to black people at the hands of whites. So she was extraordinarily cognizant of the dangers she faced in getting arrested. She writes, "I didn't know if I would get off the bus alive, but I was resigned to the fact that I had to express my unwillingness to continue to be humiliated in this manner." Over the years, Parks repeatedly highlighted that there were other people she knew on the bus, but none came to her defense. Calling it one of the worst days of my life, she said, "I felt very much alone." She fantasized about what it would have been like if the whole bus had emptied, or if the other 3 had stayed, because if they had to arrest 4 of us instead of 1, I would have felt that at least I had a little support. Parks' civil disobedience helped launch the Montgomery bus boycotts, which contributed to the Supreme Court's unanimous decision almost a year after Parks' arrest to nullify bus segregation laws in this country. Now again, there's much more to be said of all that happened in the wake of Parks' arrest, including the sexism that excluded her from the male-dominated leadership of the civil rights movement. And for the details, I encourage any of you that are interested to read The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. But to keep my focus on making sure I tell the rest of the story of Parks' life, it's often not remembered that barely more than a month after Parks refused to give up her seat, both she and her husband had been forced out of their respective jobs. They were unable to get hired anywhere else. The Parks family suffered economic hardship for a full decade, until John Conyers, Detroit's second black member elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, hired her in 1965, so that's a decade after, as his administrative assistant. But even as the family's situation began to improve economically, the negative consequences of her bravery continued, and even after moving to Detroit, Parks continued to receive hate mail and menacing phone calls well into the 1970s. I noted earlier that the tributes given upon Parks' death almost uniformly failed to note how radical she was or anything close to the full extent of the 70 decades of her lifetime activism. But while she was alive, she did the best she could to make sure people didn't forget and to subvert such misconceptions. For example, at the Kennedy Center Gala, in honor of her 77th birthday, there were many performers, almost all of them were apolitical. And when she finally got a turn to speak, what she wanted to talk about was contemporary injustice, in particular Nelson Mandela's anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. After being mugged at age 81, and that person was, as word got out that Rosa Parks had been mugged, he didn't know he was mugging Rosa Parks. He got a severe beating by the other criminal element in the community. But after she was mugged at age 81, she said, "I hope to someday see an end to conditions in our country who would make people want to hurt others." She also spoke out after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, against a military response to the attacks and to call for the U.S. to act cooperatively as part of a community of nations within the framework of international law. Theo Harris, in her conclusion, writes that doing justice to Parks's legacy requires something much harder for our nation than a simple casket lying in the Capitol. It means acknowledging the roots of racial and social injustice in American society, acknowledging that they are deep and they continue to be manifest. It entails a profound commitment to the goal she had spent her lifetime fighting for: real justice under the law for all people. Community empowerment and voting rights, educational access and equity, economic justice, and Black history in all parts of the curriculum. It calls for dedicated, persistent activism, year after year, decade after decade. That's what she did. That is her legacy to us, to create systemic social change. In her early 80s, speaking about her own legacy, Parks said, "I'd like people to say that I'm a person who wanted to be free and wanted it not only for myself. She wanted it for all people. May it be so for us and for all people." I invite you to take about a minute of silent meditation to reflect some on Parks's legacy, on King's legacy, on where this intersects with your life or with the life